April 16, 1917. Main Conference Room, German Admiralty Building, Berlin. Vice Admiral Admiral Scheer stood before a large chart of the British Isles, its surrounding waters marked with colored pins representing reported ship sinkings. Each pin represented tonnage sent to the bottom, and there were hundreds of them. Scheer, commander of the High Seas Fleet since 1916, had spent 28 years in the Imperial Navy, from cadet to fleet command. He understood naval warfare's mathematics, tonnage ratios, fuel consumption rates, the careful calculations that governed modern sea power. But the chart before him showed something that transcended traditional naval calculation. It showed Britain's maritime lifeline hemorrhaging at a rate that made victory seem inevitable. In the previous month alone, German U-boats had destroyed 860,000 tons of Allied and neutral shipping, the highest monthly total of the entire war. Scheer checked the figures against Grand Admiral Henning von Holzendorff's December memorandum, the document that had convinced Kaiser Wilhelm II to authorize unrestricted submarine warfare. The numbers aligned perfectly. At this rate, Britain would exhaust its food reserves by August, perhaps September at the latest. The mathematical certainty seemed absolute. What Scheer didn't know, what no German naval officer would understand until the shock of July's sinking reports, was that the Royal Navy was implementing a system so simple it had been dismissed as obsolete. A tactical approach so basic it seemed to belong to the age of sail rather than modern industrial warfare. Within 8 weeks, that system would reduce U-boat effectiveness by over 90%, transform the mathematics of submarine warfare, and render Holzendorff's confident calculations meaningless. The convoy system, ships sailing in protected groups rather than independently, would prove that sometimes the oldest solutions work best against the newest threats, and that German confidence in mathematical certainty had overlooked the most fundamental variable. Adaptive defense could neutralize even the most devastating offense. German naval staff confidence in December 1916 wasn't mere optimism, it was mathematical certainty backed by meticulous calculation and 2 years of operational data. Grand Admiral Henning von Holzendorff, chief of the Admiralty staff since 1915, presented his memorandum to Kaiser Wilhelm II on December 22, 1916, with the precision of an engineer solving a logistics problem. The document opened with a stark premise. By the unrestricted employment of the U-boat as a weapon of war, we can count on ending the war in at most 5 months. This wasn't speculation. Holzendorff had assembled data on British shipping capacity, food imports, domestic agricultural production, and current sinking rates. His staff had calculated British merchant tonnage available for trade, estimated U-boat operational capacity, and determined the monthly sinking rate required to achieve strategic victory. The mathematics appeared irrefutable. Britain imported 11 million tons of food, fodder, and fertilizer annually, plus raw materials for industry. British domestic agriculture produced approximately 40% of the nation's food needs, making maritime imports essential for survival. Holzendorff calculated that if U-boats could sink 600,000 tons per month of Allied and neutral shipping bound for Britain, the cumulative effect would paralyze the British economy within 5 months and force surrender by August 1917 at the latest. His memorandum specified, "We shall thus strike at England's most vulnerable spot and bring about by the destruction of English commerce a collapse that will, in a comparatively short time, force our principal enemy to make peace." The confidence derived from recent operational results. During 1916, under the restrictions imposed after the Lusitania crisis, German U-boats had sunk approximately 2.3 million tons of Allied shipping. This proved U-boat capability. The restrictions, surfacing before attack, allowing time for crews to abandon ship, avoiding passenger vessels, had limited effectiveness. Remove those restrictions, Holzendorff argued, and U-boats could double or triple their results. German naval staff studies supported this analysis. Germany possessed 111 operational U-boats in December 1916, with construction delivering approximately 8 to 10 new boats monthly. The Admiralty calculated that typically 1/3 of the fleet would be operational at sea at any time, 1/3 in port preparing for operations, and 1/3 undergoing repairs or maintenance. This meant roughly 37 U-boats actively hunting in British waters at any given moment. Each boat, operating under unrestricted warfare rules, could reasonably expect to sink 3 to 4 ships per patrol, with patrols lasting 3 to 4 weeks. This translated to approximately 15 to 20 ships sunk per U-boat per month across the active fleet. The mathematics supported the 600,000-ton monthly target. British defensive measures seemed inadequate to counter this calculated assault. The Royal Navy's anti-submarine tactics in December 1916 consisted primarily of armed merchant cruisers patrolling shipping lanes, destroyer patrols in suspected U-boat operating areas, and Q-ships, armed vessels disguised as merchantmen designed to lure U-boats to surface attack. These approaches had achieved modest results. In 1916, U-boats lost numbered only 22 boats, less than 5% of monthly operational strength, a sustainable attrition rate that wouldn't meaningfully impact offensive capability. Captain Adolf von Trotha, Chief of Staff to Admiral Scheer, had compiled tactical assessments supporting unrestricted warfare. His reports noted that British merchant ships sailed independently along predictable routes, following established shipping lanes with schedules published in Lloyd's registers. U-boat commanders could position their boats along these routes and wait for targets to arrive. The ocean, from the German perspective, had become a shooting gallery where merchant ships presented themselves as individual targets at regular intervals. Von Trotha's analysis concluded, "The English have no effective counter to the U-boat. Their patrol system covers too vast an area with too few vessels. Detection technologies remain primitive. The submarine possesses inherent advantages, invisibility, mobility, surprise, that current defensive measures cannot neutralize." This assessment reflected professional naval judgment based on available evidence. The Kaiser's authorization on February 1, 1917, seemed to release a weapon of inevitable victory. The first month exceeded expectations. February saw 540,000 tons sunk. March brought 593,000 tons. April 1917 achieved 860,000 tons, 43% above Holzendorf's target and Britain's worst month of the entire war. The mathematical progression appeared flawless. At this rate, Britain's merchant fleet would shrink below sustainable levels within weeks, not months. By mid-April 1917, Britain faced genuine strategic catastrophe. First, Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Edward Carson, informed the War Cabinet on April 23 that if shipping losses continued at April's rate, Britain would face food shortages within 6 weeks and possible starvation by autumn. The numbers were devastating. Britain's merchant fleet in April 1917 totaled approximately 20 million gross tons, including Allied and neutral shipping serving British ports. Losses of 860,000 tons in a single month represented 4.3% of the total fleet. Sustained at that rate, the fleet would cease to exist in less than 2 years, but Britain would collapse long before then. Grain reserves in April stood at 6 weeks' supply. Petroleum reserves had fallen to 3 months. Coal imports, essential for British industry despite domestic production, had declined by 30% since January. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, First Sea Lord since November 1916, confronted a defensive problem that seemed unsolvable with conventional naval doctrine. Jellicoe had commanded the Grand Fleet at Jutland, where he demonstrated the careful tactical judgment that preserved British naval superiority. But submarine warfare presented entirely different mathematics. The Royal Navy possessed approximately 350 destroyers, the primary anti-submarine vessel. These destroyers needed to protect home waters, escort capital, ships, conduct offensive patrols, and counter German surface raiders. Allocating destroyers to merchant ship protection spread the available force across thousands of square miles of ocean. The English Channel alone covered 29,000 square miles. The western approaches, the primary shipping lanes southwest of Ireland, encompassed approximately 200,000 square miles. German U-boats could approach from any direction, strike without warning, and disappear. Finding a submerged U-boat in 1917 meant visual detection of a periscope or acoustic detection through primitive hydrophones. Neither method provided reliable early warning. Patrol approaches had proven ineffective precisely because the ocean was too vast and U-boats too small. Jellicoe's initial response focused on expanding existing methods. The Admiralty increased destroyer construction, though new vessels wouldn't enter service for months. They established additional patrol zones and assigned more vessels to anti-submarine duties. They armed merchant ships with defensive deck guns, allowing them to engage surfaced U-boats. They created more Q-ships and deployed them along standard shipping routes. They experimented with nets, depth charges, and improved hydrophones. None of these measures significantly reduced losses. The fundamental problem remained. German U-boats hunting individual ships possessed overwhelming tactical advantages. A surfaced U-boat could spot a merchant ship from 10 to 12 miles on clear days. The merchant ship, unless specifically watching for periscopes, might not detect the submarine until torpedoes were in the water. Even armed merchant ships couldn't defend effectively against submerged attack. The mathematics favored the submarine. It needed only to find isolated targets in predictable locations, then strike from invisibility. Some officers, including Rear Admiral Alexander Duff, proposed convoy, grouping merchant ships together and providing naval escort. The concept seemed obvious, even ancient. Convoy had protected merchant shipping in the age of sail, when warships escorted trading fleets against privateers and commerce raiders. But modern naval doctrine dismissed convoy as obsolete, inefficient, and counterproductive for industrial-era warfare. The Admiralty's analysis identified multiple objections. First, convoy concentrated targets. If a U-boat penetrated the escort screen, it could attack multiple ships rather than just one. Second, convoy slowed commerce. Ships sailed at the speed of the slowest vessel in the group, reducing overall throughput. Third, convoy required careful coordination. Assembling ships from various ports, maintaining formation at sea, and coordinating arrivals would strain port capacity and delay deliveries. Fourth, convoy required escorts the Royal Navy didn't have. A convoy might include 20 to 40 merchant ships. Adequate protection required at least 5 to 8 destroyers per convoy. The Admiralty calculated they would need 1,500 to 2,000 destroyers to provide convoy protection for all British merchant traffic, 4 times their current force. Most fundamentally, Admiralty analysis in early 1917 calculated that approximately 5,000 ships arrived or departed British ports weekly, an impossible number to organize into convoy groups. This figure, referenced in internal memos and planning documents, seemed to prove convoys' impracticality. No system could organize 5,000 ships per week into protected groups without paralyzing British ports through vessel congestion. The mathematics appeared to demonstrate that convoy, however appealing in theory, couldn't function at the scale modern commerce required. Unknown to these analysts, their fundamental figure was catastrophically wrong. They had counted every vessel movement, including short coastal trips, ferries, fishing boats, and multiple movements by the same vessels as separate ships requiring protection. The actual number of ocean-going merchant ships requiring convoy protection was approximately 120 to 140 per week, not 5,000. This miscalculation, rooted in administrative record-keeping rather than operational analysis, had convinced the Admiralty that convoy was mathematically impossible, when in fact it was entirely practical. While German confidence in submarine warfare's mathematics seemed justified by April 1917's results, the industrial foundations of that confidence contained vulnerabilities German planners had underestimated. Germany's shipbuilding industry in 1916 to 1917 operated at impressive capacity, but faced constraints that limited U-boat production to levels barely sufficient to replace losses, while sustaining offensive operations. The Kaiserliche Werft Danzig, AG Weser Bremen, Germania Werft Kiel, and other major yards had produced 111 operational U-boats by December 1916. Production rates achieved approximately 8 to 10 boats monthly through 1917, requiring 8 to 12 months per vessel depending on type. This production tempo maintained fleet strength, but provided little margin for increased losses. Construction required specialized components. Electric motors for submerged propulsion came from Siemens Schuckert plants in Berlin and Nuremberg. Diesel engines came from MAN in Augsburg or Krupp Germania Werft. Periscopes and optical equipment came from Carl Zeiss in Jena. Torpedo production centered on Krupp's torpedo factory in Essen and the torpedo works at Friedrichsort. Each U-boat carried approximately 12 to 16 torpedoes depending on type, with reloads stored in cramped spaces throughout the hull. The Type UC-2 mine layer carried 18 mines in addition to torpedoes. The Type U-151 long-range cruiser carried supplies for 12-week patrols to American waters. Each specialized type required different components and construction processes, complicating production planning. The workforce included skilled welders, machinists, electricians, and specialists in submarine systems. By 1917, labor shortages forced increasing reliance on less experienced workers and longer training periods. Quality control became critical. Any pressure hull defect at depth could prove fatal. Testing procedures required time. Each completed boat underwent extensive sea trials, diving tests to operational depth, torpedo firing tests, and crew training exercises before operational deployment. The mathematics of attrition mattered more than German planners acknowledged. Holzendorf's memorandum had calculated monthly sinking tonnage, but hadn't adequately addressed sustainable loss rates. Germany lost 22 U-boats in 1916, approximately 20% of the operational fleet. If unrestricted warfare increased, British defensive efforts and U-boat losses rose proportionally to offensive activity. The fleet might face unsustainable attrition. Each lost U-boat represented 8 to 12 months of construction labor, 50 to 55 trained crew members, and capital investment of approximately 3 to 4 million marks. Replacing losses while expanding the fleet required production outpacing attrition, and German shipyards operated near capacity with limited ability to accelerate construction. The Royal Navy's industrial response, while slower to develop, operated from a larger industrial base with advantages in resources and manufacturing capacity. British shipyards in 1917 could produce merchant tonnage faster than U-boats could sink it if protected shipping reduced loss rates. Harland and Wolff in Belfast, John Brown and Company on the Clyde, Vickers in Barrow in Furness, and dozens of smaller yards launched merchant vessels at increasing rates through 1917. The Ministry of Munitions, directed by Winston Churchill from July 1917, coordinated merchant ship production as a war priority. British yards launched approximately 1.2 million tons of new merchant shipping in 1917, partially offsetting losses. American yards, entering the war in April 1917, would add significant capacity by 1918. Britain's destroyer construction accelerated through 1917. The Admiralty had ordered emergency programs of V and W-class destroyers in 1916, with 67 vessels authorized and construction proceeding at multiple yards. These destroyers, designed specifically for convoy escort duty, displaced 1,100 tons, mounted 4 4-inch guns, and carried depth charges and hydrophones. They achieved 34 knots and possessed the endurance for Atlantic convoy escort. The first V and W-class destroyers entered service in late 1917, with production accelerating through 1918. The industrial race favored Britain's larger shipbuilding capacity, but only if convoy protected existing tonnage while new construction came online. Without convoy, U-boats would sink ships faster than British yards could build them. With convoy reducing losses to sustainable levels, British production would eventually overcome German submarine offensive. The industrial mathematics, properly calculated, didn't support Holzendorf's confident timeline. German victory required maintaining 600,000-ton monthly losses indefinitely, while British shipyards sat idle. Neither condition proved sustainable. The convoy system implemented in May 1917 represented not technological innovation but tactical adaptation, applying centuries-old maritime practice to industrial warfare with devastating effectiveness. Commander Reginald Henderson, director of the Trade Division at the Admiralty, had advocated convoy since early 1917, arguing that concentration of defenses would prove more effective than dispersed patrols. Henderson's analysis, presented to the Admiralty in March 1917, challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying anti-convoy arguments. If only 120 to 140 ocean-going vessels required weekly protection rather than 5,000 total ship movements, convoy became practically feasible. Henderson's staff recalculated destroyer requirements. A convoy of 30 to 40 merchant ships required 6 to 8 destroyer escorts, 1 ahead of the convoy, 2 on each flank, 2 astern. At any given time, approximately 10 to 15 convoys would be at sea crossing the Atlantic, requiring 100 to 150 destroyers total. The Royal Navy possessed that force if it reallocated destroyers from ineffective patrol duties to convoy escort. The tactical logic reversed German assumptions. U-boats hunting along, shipping lanes expected to find isolated targets at regular intervals. Convoy emptied the sea lanes. Where U-boats previously encountered ships daily, they now encountered empty ocean. When they did locate a convoy, they found not an isolated merchantman, but a protected group surrounded by destroyers, with coordinated defensive measures and limited approach opportunities. A U-boat commander observing a convoy through his periscope faced difficult mathematics. The convoy might contain 40 ships spread across several square miles, with escorts patrolling the perimeter. The U-boat, moving at 7 to 8 knots, submerged with limited battery endurance, had perhaps one attack opportunity as the convoy passed. It might sink 1, perhaps 2 ships, if extremely fortunate, before escorts detected the attack and forced it deep with depth charges. The previous tactical environment, leisurely surface pursuit, careful torpedo setup, multiple targets, vanished. Convoy forced U-boats into hasty, submerged attacks with single opportunities and substantial risk. The first experimental convoy departed Gibraltar on May 10, 1917, consisting of 17 merchant ships, escorted by 4 destroyers and 2 armed yachts. The convoy reached Britain on May 20th without losses. On May 24th, the first homeward-bound convoy departed Hampton Roads, Virginia, with 12 ships escorted by American destroyers to the mid-Atlantic rendezvous point, where Royal Navy escorts took over for the approach to Britain. Not a single ship was lost. The Admiralty, stunned by the immediate results, rapidly expanded the system. By August 1917, all transatlantic traffic sailed in convoy. By September, Mediterranean convoys operated regularly. By November, convoy extended to South American and African routes. The implementation required extensive organization. Assembly ports needed space to gather merchant ships and load cargoes on coordinated schedules. Convoy, commodores, typically retired Royal Navy officers, commanded each merchant group, enforcing formation and signaling procedures. Escorts required training in anti-submarine tactics, depth charge employment, and hydrophone operation. The Ministry of Shipping, created in December 1916, coordinated sailing schedules, cargo priorities, and port capacities. The system's complexity would have paralyzed maritime commerce if imposed before the crisis, but with April 1917's losses threatening national survival, British shipping accepted the restrictions. The tactical results appeared immediately in June 1917's statistics. Total losses fell to 687,000 tons, down from April's 860,000 despite expanded U-boat operations. July brought 555,000 tons lost. August declined to 511,000 tons. The trend continued through autumn. By December 1917, losses had fallen to 399,000 tons, less than half April's catastrophic total. Even more dramatically, losses among ships sailing in convoy dropped to less than 1% per voyage. Between May 1917 and November 1918, approximately 16,070 ships sailed in convoy to and from British ports. Of these, U-boats sank only 154 ships, a loss rate of 0.96%. Compare this to independent sailings, where loss rates reached 25% on some routes during April 1917's crisis. The convoy system hadn't eliminated U-boat effectiveness entirely, but it had reduced that effectiveness to levels British industrial capacity could sustain. The mathematical certainty Holzendorf had presented in December 1916 collapsed not through technological breakthrough but through tactical adaptation. The impact of convoy on U-boat operations became apparent through July and August. 1917's increasingly frustrated war diary entries from submarine commanders. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, commander of U-20, and the officer who had sunk the Lusitania in 1915, reported in his July 1917 patrol. Sighted smoke on horizon bearing 240 degrees, approximately 15 miles distant. Closed to investigate. Discovered convoy of 25 to 30 merchant ships with destroyer escorts. Attempted to position for attack on convoy's flank. Destroyers detected periscope at 1,200 meters, forcing deep dive. Pursued by depth charges for 35 minutes, taking damage to port hydroplane. Convoy passed while submerged. No attack possible. Schwieger's experience represented the new tactical reality. Previously, sighting smoke meant tracking and sinking an isolated target. Now, it meant discovering a protected formation that could detect, counterattack, and force the U-boat deep before any engagement. Korvettenkapitän Klaus Ricker, commanding U-103, reported similar frustration in August 1917. Patrol Area C7, western approaches, 14 days on station. Sighted no independent merchant traffic. Located convoy August 18th, 35 ships with heavy escort. Attempted night surface approach, detected by escort at 3,000 meters, forced to crash dive under gunfire. August 22nd, located second convoy, 40 ships. Successfully penetrated escort screen submerged, fired 3 torpedoes at overlapping targets. 1 torpedo struck 8,000-ton freighter amidships. Remaining torpedoes missed. Forced deep by immediate depth charge attack. Pursued for 2 hours. Substantial damage to pressure hull frames. Minor flooding in forward torpedo room. Returned to base without further contacts. Ricker's patrol demonstrated convoy's effect even when U-boats achieved success. 1 ship sunk from a convoy represented a 2.5% loss rate for that convoy, operationally insignificant. For the U-boat, penetrating escort defenses, achieving firing position, and surviving the counterattack consumed resources and exposed the boat to destruction for minimal strategic effect. German naval staff recognized the crisis by September 1917. Admiral Scheer reported to the Kaiser that convoy had fundamentally altered the tactical situation in the Atlantic. His September 15th assessment noted, British merchant traffic now proceeds in protected groups, escorted by destroyers. Our U-boats encounter long periods at sea without targets, followed by brief encounters with heavily defended convoys. The previous tactical advantage, leisurely surface pursuit and attack of isolated ships, no longer exists. Commanders report that approaches to convoys risk immediate counterattack with depth charges, and that even successful attacks yield diminishing results as convoys maintain schedule despite single ship losses. The mathematics had reversed. Instead of U-boats finding abundant targets with minimal risk, they now found rare targets with substantial danger. Holzendorf's December 1916 memorandum had assumed unrestricted warfare would increase U-boat effectiveness by removing tactical constraints. Convoy proved that concentrating defenses could neutralize offensive advantages regardless of tactical freedom. The toll on German submarines escalated through late 1917 and 1918. In 1917, Germany lost 63 U-boats, nearly triple 1916's losses. In 1918, losses reached 68 boats. The causes varied: depth charges from convoy escorts, mines in approach routes, Q-ship engagements, anti-submarine patrols. But convoy's introduction correlated directly with rising U-boat casualties. British depth charge technology, primitive in early 1917, improved substantially as convoy provided concentrated defense opportunities. The Type D depth charge, introduced in January 1917, contained 300 pounds of TNT in a cylindrical case dropped from destroyer sterns. Detonation at preset depth created pressure waves capable of rupturing submarine hulls within 30 feet or causing damage through shock at greater distances. Early models proved unreliable, but by mid-1917, improved fuses and handling procedures made depth charges the primary anti-submarine weapon. Convoy escorts carried 30 to 50 depth charges each, allowing sustained attacks on detected submarines. The tactical sequence became standardized: hydrophone detection or periscope sighting destroyer approaching at high speed, depth charge pattern released over estimated submarine position, continued pursuit until contact lost or submarine destroyed. This tactic succeeded only when escorts had specific areas to defend, convoy routes, rather than endless ocean to patrol. The mathematical advantage shifted. In open ocean patrol, a destroyer might cover 200 square miles daily, searching for a submarine that could be anywhere within 50,000 square miles. Convoy escort concentrated that destroyer's protection on specific ships in specific locations, creating defensive density that individual patrol could never achieve. By December 1917, German naval commanders acknowledged that unrestricted submarine warfare had failed to achieve its strategic objective. Britain had not starved. The August 1917 surrender deadline had passed, with British food reserves stabilized. The mathematical certainty of December 1916 had proven illusory. Convoy had reduced U-boat effectiveness below strategic significance while raising U-boat losses to unsustainable levels. Germany's submarine fleet in December 1917 numbered approximately 140 boats, increased from 111 a year earlier through new construction. But monthly sinking tonnage had fallen from April's 860,000 tons to December's 399,000 tons, despite more U-boats at sea. Effectiveness per U-boat had collapsed by over 60%. The calculation Holzendorf had presented, 600,000 tons monthly equals British starvation, required sustained losses that Convoy had made impossible. The industrial mathematics now favored Britain. Merchant ship construction outpaced convoy losses, while U-boat construction barely replaced rising casualties. The definitive recognition of Convoy's effectiveness came not during the war, but in post-war assessments, when both sides analyzed the campaign with access to complete records. Grand Admiral Reinhard Scheer's memoir, published in 1920 as Germany's high sea fleet in the World War, acknowledged, "The convoy system introduced by the British in May 1917 fundamentally altered the submarine warfare campaign. Our calculations in December 1916, which had seemed certain to achieve victory by August 1917, failed to account for the possibility that Britain would concentrate its merchant shipping into protected groups. This tactical adaptation, simple in concept but requiring extensive organization, reduced U-boat effectiveness to levels that could not achieve strategic objectives. The submarine remained a formidable weapon, but Convoy neutralized its decisive potential." Scheer's admission carried particular weight given his position as architect of Germany's naval strategy through 1917 to 1918. Admiral Jellicoe's post-war writings, particularly The Submarine Peril, published in 1934, reflected on the near disaster of April 1917 and Convoy's salvation. In April 1917, Britain faced genuine strategic catastrophe. Shipping losses exceeded 800,000 tons, and if sustained, would have forced British surrender within months. Food reserves had fallen to 6 weeks. The Admiralty's conventional anti-submarine measures, patrol, Q-ships, armed merchantmen, had proven inadequate to counter the U-boat threat. The convoy system, which some officers had dismissed as obsolete, proved to be the decisive countermeasure. By concentrating our defenses around protected groups rather than dispersing them across empty ocean, we reduced losses to sustainable levels and maintained the maritime supply line essential to Allied victory. Jellicoe's reflection revealed the Admiralty's initial reluctance and the pressure required to implement convoy despite doctrinal resistance. The official British statistical analysis, compiled in 1919, provided definitive numbers. Between May 1917 and November 1918, 95,000 merchant ship sailings occurred to and from British ports. Of these, approximately 16,070 sailed in. Ocean convoy, with 154 losses, a 0.96% loss rate. Independent sailings, primarily coastal traffic, and vessels from neutral ports that hadn't adopted convoy, suffered approximately 2,616 losses from 78,930 sailings, a 3.3% loss rate. The comparison demonstrated convoy's effectiveness conclusively. Ships in convoy enjoyed more than 3 times the survival rate of independent ships. The total tonnage saved exceeded 5 million tons, the difference between national survival and starvation. Germany's submarine losses told the parallel story. From May 1917 through November 1918, Germany lost 131 U-boats, 54% of the peak operational fleet. Causes included depth charges from convoy escorts, 48 boats, mines in approach routes, 32 boats, anti-submarine patrols, 22 boats, accidents, and other causes, 29 boats. The rising loss rate directly correlated with convoy implementation and the increased defensive density convoy created. Post-war German naval studies acknowledged the strategic miscalculation. A 1923 analysis by the German Naval Archives concluded, the submarine campaign of 1917 to 1918 failed to achieve its strategic objective despite technological and tactical advantages. The fundamental error lay in calculating that Britain could not effectively organize its merchant shipping into protected convoys at the scale required. British organizational capacity and industrial resources, underestimated in our December 1916 analysis, proved sufficient to implement convoy rapidly and comprehensively. Once implemented, convoy reduced U-boat effectiveness below the 600,000-ton monthly threshold necessary for strategic success. Simultaneously, convoy concentrated British anti-submarine forces, increasing U-boat losses to unsustainable levels. The mathematical certainty that guided our decision to implement unrestricted warfare proved illusory. Industrial warfare required not only offensive capability, but also defensive organization at scales that traditional naval doctrine had not anticipated. The strategic consequences extended beyond immediate military effects. Unrestricted submarine warfare brought the United States into the war in April 1917, adding American industrial capacity and manpower to the Allied cause. The Zimmermann telegram and attacks on American shipping crystallized American public opinion against Germany. By November 1918, American forces in France numbered 2 million men, with 10,000 arriving daily at peak deployment rates. American merchant shipping, protected by convoy, delivered supplies and troops without significant losses. The 1.8 million American soldiers who crossed the Atlantic between April 1917 and November 1918 sailed in convoy, with only 637 casualties from submarine attack, a loss rate of 0.035%. Germany's submarine campaign, intended to achieve victory before American intervention could matter, instead failed to prevent that intervention while providing justification for American entry. Admiral William Sims, commander of U.S. naval forces in European waters, reflected in his 1920 memoir, The Convoy System, which the British Admiralty initially resisted but ultimately implemented with full commitment, proved to be the decisive tactical innovation of the naval war. It demonstrated that concentration of force, even defensive force, could overcome dispersed offensive capability. The submarine, which had seemed to provide Germany with a war-winning weapon, proved vulnerable to organized defense. Convoy didn't eliminate submarine effectiveness, but it reduced that effectiveness to levels that Allied industrial capacity could overcome. In retrospect, the mathematical confidence German planners expressed in December 1916 reflected incomplete understanding of how industrial-scale organization could adapt to new threats. Modern warfare required not only new weapons, but also new organizational systems operating at unprecedented scales. The convoy system's legacy extended to World War II, where Allied and Axis powers both implemented convoy from the war's beginning, recognizing the lessons of 1917 to 1918. The Battle of the Atlantic in World War II repeated many patterns from World War I. Initial U-boat success against unprepared defenses, followed by convoy implementation, technological adaptation, and eventual Allied superiority through industrial capacity and organizational systems. The fundamental insight remained: concentration of defenses around protected groups proved more effective than dispersed patrol, and industrial warfare demanded organizational innovation as much as technological development. The convoy system of 1917 demonstrated that sometimes the oldest solutions, properly adapted to new conditions, solve problems that modern doctrine dismisses as impossible. German confidence in mathematical certainty in December 1916 overlooked the most fundamental variable: Adaptive organization could neutralize even the most devastating offensive capability, transforming certain victory into strategic defeat through tactical adaptation at industrial scale.